So let's talk about some of the strongest things that the Tyranids can put on the table right now, with a look at 5 strong tournament stomping army lists for the faction, and a closer look at a few of the units used by good players. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video we're taking a look at some of the strongest army lists in the current game for the Hive fleets. In 10th edition, Tyranids so far have had a few ups and downs. They started the edition maybe in not too bad a place, around about 50% wins or so following their codex, though they maybe were a bit weird in the way that they played after that came out, a bit too overly reliant on battle shock shenanigans and Biovores and Rippers rustling up secondary objective points. As the codexes came out and a bunch of balance passes happened, the Tyranids just fell further and further behind until they were one of the weakest factions in the game, prompting Games Workshop to actually take a good look at the faction when Pariah Nexus came out, giving them a whole bunch of interesting updates to rules, detachments, and sometimes weapon profiles, which does seem to have been a much needed shot in the arm for the Tyranids overall. Currently at tournaments they're looking a lot more balanced, with win rates around about 50% or so. They've won 3 big tournaments since the balance update, and the competitive play rate is really quite popular. Tyranids are widely played in 10th edition given all the new models and the big focus that they got, and a lot of people have been looking forward to having the army get some improvements, so it's brought lots of people back to playing them in events. For the detachments that people are most commonly using, it tends to be Invasion Fleet and Vanguard Onslaight as the most played. Invasion Fleet just giving a whole load of all-round might with their damage boosts, reactive feel no pain, and a few others. And Vanguard Onslaight seems to be really viable as well, giving loads of buffs to all the Vanguard invaders, many of which got far more interesting after the update, things like Morlocks and Trigons getting the keyword, and Broodlords with Gene Stealers making the Gene Stealers strength 5 with the new Synapse rules as well, making them pretty terrifying in this detachment. Otherwise, Synaptic Nexus is the next most played, which also seems to be doing kind of similarly well in the tournament win statistics at least. Again, a fairly general purpose one, with some buffs that help a bunch of units, and it doesn't really hurt to be focusing on synapsed creatures, given that +1 strength buff, and then unfortunately the others are played a little bit less. Unending Swarm had some good success before the update, but it seems that it's just killed a lot of people's enthusiasm for it when they made the reinforcement stratagem once per game, so the Unending Swarm rather counterintuitively has an end now. Crusher Stampede and Assimilation Swarm I'd rate both as playable, but solidly behind the others. In any case, in this video I thought we'd take a look through 5 strong army lists for the Tyranids that have done well with various players at big grand tournaments, and talk about a few of the datasheets being used as well. First up, let's start with the Invasion Fleet, the Index Tyranid detachment with the hyper adaptations, getting either sustained hits against infantry and swarms, lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or precision against characters on critical hits. The core rule's quite a nice damage buff that really helps against skew lists such as things like Imperial Knights or tank heavy armies. They've got some nice stratagems, including being able to flex out those hyper adaptations if you need a bit more damage here and there. Several very usable enhancements, and that 5+ feel no pain stratagem if you're within Synapse range, which is easily one that you could use every single turn on the biggest monster that's going to be taking the most damage. This list, recorded by a Kenneth Onyebor, was used to take second at Salt Lake Open Grand Tournament, going 6 wins to 1 loss against a big tournament of 99 players, so really quite a respectable placement for the Tyranids there. This one's a seriously monster-heavy Tyranids army, plus having a big unit of Zoanthropes with a Neurotyrant on the go. The core of the list seems to be 3 Exocrines plus 3 Maleceptors, a whole load of big and stompy Tyranid firepower. I feel like both of these are kind of hard to go wrong with. Nice general purpose damage 3 firepower, and monsters that are fairly tanky for their cost. Particularly nice against elite infantry, though they could all have lethal hits if needed in an anti-tank type matchup. Presumably ranging ahead into the midfield are a pair of Auspexes, cheap and fighty monsters with a fairly staggering amount of attacks that can cut through enemy infantry with ease, and definitely do a bit of damage to heavy hitters as well, very efficient for the cost. And running up alongside them is Old One Eye, accompanied by a Carnifex, another big and dangerous melee monster. He gives 4 rerolls to hit to the Carnifex, which is armed with a heavy venom cannon and some crushing claws. Between all that, the enemy anti-tank weapons are going to be kind of stretched. The Auspexes are likely to soak up a lot of fire in the midboard and might not have enough left over for the guns that are following them up. Then one combo that came about after the balanced data slate is a Neurotyrant leading a bunch of Zoanthropes. This gives the Tyranids some enormously scary anti-tank shooting, the Zoanthropes being quite a lot more scary if they're hitting on a 2+, and potentially occasionally with +1 to wound if they can hit something that's battle shocked, and the Neurotyrant's just nice for debuffing Shadow in the Warp, plus having his own torrent attack. Then there's a whole bunch of Tyranid objective support type units. A Biovore's nice to throw out Spore Mines, which can still do certain secondary objectives and can sit on a home field objective. A Lictor's nice for rapid ingress, and cheap lone operatives are great in general. There's 2 Neurolictors, which can hand out +1 to wound if they fail Battle Shock, but just have the chance of enemies not being able to contest objectives in the mid-board, and that could easily be worth the swing of a few victory points. And then 2 individual Pyrovores. Pretty nice to have some very cheap 35-point units hanging around with a bit of objective control. They can be nice for doing actions and things, and their damage and defense stats are absolutely fine with a Torrent Flamer and 5 wounds for 35 points. Overall looks like a pretty scary Nidzilla list with a good amount of objective scoring support. I feel like you'd struggle if you ran into this and you didn't have enough anti-tank weapons. To take a look at these, the Exocrine was good before the balance update and only got better. That bioplasmic cannon gets you d6 plus 3 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3. It can be hitting on a 2+ if it's static, and it hands out a reroll hit rolls of 1, which could buff other Exocrines or the Maleceptor. Plus also it can work really well with Hive Tyrants. Now they hand out lethal hits, which weren't present in this list, but they still could get lethal hits from the detachment rule. In any case, very scary anti-elite shooting with the blast rule. And for 135 points, 14 wounds at toughness 10 isn't bad on the defensive front at all. Maleceptors can be tempting to push up the board a little bit. They're 35 points more than the Exocrines, but they have toughness 11, a 4+ invulnerable save, and debuff enemy units up close, -1 to hit within 6 inches, which can give them an extra layer of defense in melee. They also provide Synapse, which is quite nice. Some close range psychic shooting with better strength but lower AP than the Exocrines version, and do actually have a bit of melee threat. That'll now be strength 10 after the Synapse buff. They can also get on pretty well with Hive Tyrants as well. Being able to have the advance and shoot from Assault is nice with the Onslaught ability. Next up, we've got a Vanguard Onslaught list. This one was run by Inez Wilson, who used it to take first at Dumfries Gamers 40k Charity GT, 5 wins undefeated at a 50-player tournament. Vanguard Onslaught is the other detachment that's really commonly run for competitive Tyranids right now. The core rule gives all the Vanguard Invader keyword units advance and charge, and can also fall back and charge with everything. They've got a disruptive hunting grounds enhancement that's 20 points, and it means that when you set up a reserve unit on the battlefield, there's a good chance they have to test Battle Shock, which occasionally can be massively disruptive for enemies scoring points. The Neurotyrant has this one here, and also access to some redeploys via a different enhancement. Several of the stratagems are really powerful as well. There's one of the ones that prevents shooting at greater than 18 inches for any Vanguard Invader keyword, which is pretty powerful when you can put it on some big chunky units like Trigons and Morlocks now. Good for winged Hive Tyrants as well, and can make lone operatives untargetable beyond 6 inches, which is really massive and could counter enemies moving to try and delete them. There's also a reactive move one and a return to reserve one. Return to reserve is particularly powerful with Morlocks, and you can arrive reserves early as well in this one, again really useful for those. In any case, this list is headed up by a Neurotyrant with Hunting Grounds. I guess again he's leading that squad of 6 Zoanthropes. I guess the Neurotyrant itself would play a little bit cagey to keep that Shadow in the Warp debuff, the Synapse, and Hunting Grounds on the board until a bit later, but the Zoanthropes could maybe just push up a little bit further and get line of sight and a lot of damage. The Swarmlord's here to rustle up some extra command points for all those nice stratagems. It's the Warlord, and he's got a lot more interesting post-data slate. Strength 10 on the Bone Sabers is nice, as is the command point debuff, where everything costs more CP. There's 2 units of 10 Hormagaunts for fast-moving objective control, a single Biovore, a single Lictor, 2 Neurolictors, and 1 Pyrovore this time. All of those super disruptive with the faster movement of the Vanguard Invaders and still being able to charge, plus even more options with stopping them being shot. Then there's still a bit of Tyranid heavy firepower with 2 Exocrines and a Maleceptor, but in this one they're backed up by 2 Morlocks and a Trigon. The Morlocks could come up together and put perhaps a surprising amount of mortal wounds on the enemy, and then think about returning to reserve if they're not engaged or dealt with. And the Trigon's a nasty Vanguard Invader that could be a good rapid ingress threat, turning up anywhere just outside of 3 inches of the enemy and then getting to work on them next turn, or do secondary objectives like jumping into the backfield and doing behind enemy lines and things. Obviously seems to have had great success. I've seen plenty of Vanguard Onslaught lists doing well with other units as well, maybe things like melee warriors with a prime, gargoyles, or gene stealers with broodlords, hitting extra hard at strength 5 now. For a couple of unit highlights out of this one though, probably worth mentioning the Swarmlord at 240 points. Nice to see him genuinely being taken again. It seems that the data slate changes have done enough to allow him to work in competitive. The Synapse buff makes those Bone Sabers strength 10, so 8 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3 twin linked is going to leave a mark. He farms up the command points and also debuffs enemy command points nearby, which can be very disruptive if he's in the midboard. Slightly longer Synapse range certainly doesn't hurt to buff nearby melee things either. The Zoanthrope Neurotyrant combo does seem to be an interesting one. Several lists using 6 of these guys, with the option for some actual seriously quite efficient anti-tank for the Tyranids. They get essentially 6 las cannon shots with lethal hits to 24-inch range, and they can swap that out for Warp Blast if they happen to be shooting against elite infantry, which is also very scary, and add some invulnerable saves to nearby Tyranids if relevant. They provide Synapse and also have a small chance to Spirit Leech things nearby. They can maybe be a bit variable as to how well they do with their invulnerable saves though, either tanking a weird amount of damage or going down surprisingly quickly. Typically leading them now is often a Neurotyrant, 105 points for the Great Big Brain Bug. This guy's been a competitive staple since Tyranids early in the edition, just having one to perhaps guard the home field, make Shadow in the Warp better, and provide extra Synapse tended to be enough to see them in getting included. The Psychic Torrent is actually at least fairly punchy at 2d6, strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 hits, can certainly fry a few Space Marines. They're just extra good with Zoanthropes now though, a +1 to the hit and maybe a +1 to wound if the targets have got battle shocked, maybe with Neurolictors or Shadow in the Warp. And I was wondering whether or not the big guns never tire interaction was intended or not, but given that Games Workshop basically seems to publish FAQs that agreed with it in the last update, it does indeed seem that the Neurotyrant is meant to give Zoanthropes big guns never tire, and that's really quite a big deal to ensure them against getting locked up in close combat, where that could be one way to basically neutralise them. They're just a lot more scarier if you know you're still going to be able to fire with them, even if they get tapped by an enemy swarm or something. Next up, for another Invasion Fleet list, this one was by Greg Chamberlain, who used it to take first at Peterborough Slam GT, 5 wins and no losses in a 30-player grand tournament. This one's still going pretty monster heavy like the last one, there's definitely a whole bunch of shifted choices. There's still a couple of Exocrines and Maleceptors, but for other monster support there's 2 Tyrannofexes, one of them taking the scary and upgunned Rupture Cannon, the other one taking the Acid Spray for a bit of Overwatch nastiness. There's also a Hive Tyrant here. As mentioned, he's pretty good with Onslaight for Exocrines and Maleceptors, allowing them to advance and shoot and also get lethal hits. Plus his Stratagem aura is nice. It's kind of cool to see Norn Emissaries actually getting played in tournament topping lists as well. There's one of them here, and again they were one of the units that came out of the balance pass doing pretty well. The Synapse buff had them going from strength 9 to strength 10, which is quite a big breakpoint for their melee, as they just seemed a bit weedy on the damage output front before. It's just quite nice to have one of those march up to a midfield objective and then basically secure that point and be ridiculously hard to shift with the Feel No Pain. Beyond that, for objective support on this one, again there's 2 sets of Hormigorns, a Death Leaper Biovore and Neurolictor for some good lone operatives and some board control with the Biovore. And then it's kind of cool to see a big unit of 6 Tyranid warriors with melee bioweapons, a pretty savage amount of twin link damage output there. I'd say their main issue is they're still a bit fragile for the points, but can be a pretty nasty counter-charged unit if they can get the jump on something from behind terrain. Again, they were certainly a unit that enjoyed the Synapse buff, going from strength 5 to strength 6 on those close combat weapons. The Hive Tyrant still seems to be a pretty good staple in a lot of Invasion Fleet lists in particular, 235 points for a Tyranid Commander-in-Chief, strength 10 melee now with the Synapse, and then -1 command point stratagems. That's a really flexible rule, affecting any Tyranids within 12 inches, and it's once per turn, not per battle round as well. Certainly one of the best free stratagem things in the game. Lots of good core stratagems that you can use it on as well, such as maybe giving that Tyrannofex in the previous list free Overwatch, or doing free heroic interventions now. The Onslaight aura buff is also nice for assault and lethal hits. He might be a model that you want to play with a bit more cagely compared with some though, perhaps using terrain to good effect, and maybe have him as the second wave of Tyranids. Otherwise at 235 points he seems like pretty much the top priority threat to try and take out. Even with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, 10 wounds at toughness 10 just isn't that much for that cost. When he does commit though, he can at least do a bit of damage with a heavy venom cannon and a bone sword, so it can be a scary melee threat to move up into the mid board in the late game. It's nice to see Tyrannofexes getting a bit more play as well, 190 points for the very big Tyranids battle tank type monster. 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a once per game ability to blanker damage is massive. Basically Land Raider style durability for far less cost than a Land Raider. For their damage output, Plenty of lists seem to be using both the Acid Spray or the Rupture Cannon. The Acid Spray is fairly tried and tested for nasty Overwatch threat in the midboard and can make a mess of some elite infantry. The Rupture Cannon is the big casino cannon. 2 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 6 now after the boost. Massively intimidating for any armoured targets on the other side of the board. They can't ever really relax until it's dealt with, and most armies just really aren't going to be able to deal with this sort of very tough profile if it's lurking all the way at the back of the board. Otherwise, as you've seen in the last few lists, Biovores are still a really tempting option for Tyranid objective scoring. People were lamenting Spore Mines being OC0 and not being able to do actions and things in the last update, and wondering if Games Workshop would help Tyranids out enough to compensate for that. It seems that they did. Still a single Biovore is often in competitive lists, just 50 points now. The Spore Mines can't do every secondary objective, but they can still do quite a lot of important ones, like help with engaging all fronts or behind enemy lines. And that's quite nice utility for a model that you can just have sat somewhere in your deployment zone and doing a bit of screening, maybe sat on the home field objective, or just taking up some space so the enemy doesn't deep strike too close elsewhere. If you're going to use something very cheap like a Pyrovore for that kind of purpose, then spending the extra 15 points on this guy doesn't really seem like the worst for the extra board control the Spore Mines can bring, and they can be also used to prevent advance moves, which occasionally can be absolutely massive for enemy units trying to get onto objectives and things. Next up, for a bit less of a cookie cutter list, here we have a Crusher Stampede one. This one played by Jacob Gold, who used it to take third at the Boise Cup, going undefeated with 4 wins and 1 draw in a 51-player tournament. It is really cool seeing someone manage to make Crusher Stampede work. I still argue it's underpowered compared with the other detachments in the codex that did get a couple of improvements on the last update. The monsters now actually get something when they're uninjured, getting +2 objective control until the opponents damage them, and when they're damaged they get +1 to hit and then +1 to wound if they're below half strength. It now means that at least they get a little advantage if the enemy leaves things untouched. Otherwise they've got a few damage dealer stratagems, things like a sort of pseudo tank shot called Massive Impact, rampaging monstrosities for re-rolling hit rolls, automatic deadly demise which can be big on the right monster, and a slightly improved version of a stratagem called Untrammeled Ferocity, allowing you to smash through bits of terrain which makes them far harder to screen against and allow the monsters to get where they need to go. For the menagerie of monsters in this list, there's 2 Exocrines and a Maleceptor, which maybe isn't too surprising, 2 Auspexes, which I think gain a lot from the detachment and make really good use of things like the reroll hit rolls. The extra objective control and the damage buffs certainly won't hurt them either. There's a Tyrannofex with a Rupture Cannon and again a single Norna Emissary. That one can provide a bit of a synapse and also could be a very scary target for the Corrosive Viscera auto-explode type thing if it does happen to die surrounded by enemies. Otherwise there's a Hive Tyrant to lead them into battle, all very good for the advancing and shooting. A Neurotyrant to presumably hover in the backfield and buff the shadow, 1 Lictor, 1 Neurolictor and Death Leaper for all the good lone operative support, 2 units of 10 Gargoyles for fast moving, move shoot move objective control chaff, 3 Raveners and a single Pyrovore. Really fun to see a Nidzilla list do well with its own themed attachment. Nice to see someone rewarded for daring to be brave with a different sort of list at a grand tournament. We've talked through the vast majority of those monsters already, so maybe just focusing on a couple of the other objective support type units. Neurolictors still seem to be a staple, despite going up to 90 points. They do get Synapse now, so their own melee is a little bit scarier, plus they buff other things. And then they're just a somewhat tanky lone operative that has a bunch of damage 1 attacks, but more importantly hands out a battle shock test, and for anything that fails within 12 inches, the enemy units are -1 to hit, and other Tyranids are +1 to wound them, can be a death sentence for certain units that get focused by a bunch of, say, Exocrine fire or something. Just being able to flip objectives in the middle and the command phase is a really big deal too. The other Lictor variants are both great as well. Death Leaper's nice and tough, has fights first with a bunch of damage too, and forces more battle shock tests even on things that just had chip damage. And the standard Lictor is a very cheap lone operative, which again is similarly threatening to Death Leaper, and he gets free rapid ingress, which can be very disruptive with him getting to annoying locations on the board and disrupting enemy units that really don't want to be in melee with a Lictor. Pyrovores seem near enough auto-include for action type units. 35 points for a unit with 1 objective control can be good for doing actions and objectives. Maybe you could put them in strategic reserve or use them to screen the backfield a little bit, preventing enemies from deep striking nearby if it's necessary. And then as mentioned, their damage and defense is pretty fine for that cost. 5 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save is going to need more than a bit of incidental firepower to take down. Their flamethrower can take a chunk out of lighter infantry, and they can even do some synergy for the army where it's necessary, the burning spray stripping enemy cover. That could be a big deal for certain units like maybe the Exocrines or Maleceptors, potentially against things like Space Marines in cover with Armour of Contempt. Finally, I thought it would be good to look at a Synaptic Nexus list. They haven't been taking quite as many of the podium spots at tournaments recently, though their win percentages are doing kind of fine. I feel like they'd be more likely to have a few more top spots if more people were playing them. But here's one of the better examples of them doing well. This list by Rami Tawil was used to take 9th at a TGX tournament in Canada, going 5 wins to 1 loss, which is certainly no mean feat against a 97-player tournament, and the same win-loss record as a bunch of stuff that was on the podium. Synaptic Nexus is a detachment where you get the Synaptic Imperatives, 3 turns of different buffs, +1 to hit in melee, a 5+ invulnerable save, and a +1 to advance and charge, plus some nice enhancements. There's Synaptic Control here on the Hive Tyrant for a -1 damage, which is some nice extra tankiness, and the power of the Hive Mind is a very good one for the Neurotyrant, +1 strength and an extra AP to the Psychic Torrent, taking it from being a kind of incidental threat to something that's seriously savage at strength 6 AP 2. Not bad for 10 points. There's a bunch of stratagems that are situationally interesting, maybe the single most reliable one being the Irresistible Will one. You basically nominate a target in the shooting or fight phase for 1 command point, and then everything within 6 inches of your Synapse model gets to reroll 1s to hit and wound against it, and that's really quite a big damage buff. It'd certainly be nice for the Neurotyrant plus Zoanthropes here for a whole barrage of very accurate rerolling fire. Plus it's pretty great just for a Norn Emissary or Norn Assimilator just fighting in melee full stop. It's basically a +36% increase to their damage output on average, which is pretty big when it's applied to such a big model. This list really does seem to be committing to the theme, with 5 units that are just really enormous Synapse keyword threats. There's that Hive Tyrant with the Bone Sword and Synaptic Control, handing out the free stratagems to things nearby, again could be good for the Irresistible Will. There's the Swarmlord with the command point shenanigans that he brings. I guess that he's probably going to be the one that's joining the Tyrant Guard, so he could move into the midfield and get that stratagem debuff to work and give you just an absolutely enormous Synapse threat. A great target for stratagems and the detachment main special rules, and genuinely quite a tanky unit as well, given the Tyrant Guard are really quite chunky for the points. I'd guess perhaps the Psychophage might be running alongside them, giving them a 6+ feel no pain. There's then the Neurotyrant and Zoanthropes once again. Very nice to have some scary anti-tank firepower with big guns never tire as insurance. And then both the Emissary and the Norn Assimilator as well, which can be really chunky on some midfield objectives. The Assimilator being the lesser played one, though it does seem to have had some pretty good success here. I think realistically it's not as far behind the Emissary as a lot of the internet seems to think. It's not quite as chunky and is a bit more expensive, but it does have an enormous amount of anti-tank damage, and in Synaptic Nexus it has access to the reinforced Hive node stratagem for basically Tyrannid Armour of Contempt. That's quite a big deal given that it's a big tough monster that has a 2+ save and doesn't get an invulnerable. Then beyond all the Synaptic nastiness, there's a unit of 10 termagants to score, 1 Biovore for the Spore Mine things, 1 Neurolictor for flipping objectives and maybe buffing things with the Battle Shock debuff, a single unit of Ripper Swarms, which again can be used to pop up and either screen board bits or do secondary objectives like engage on all fronts, and 1 single Exocrine for a bit of anti-elite type firepower. Overall quite a cool army list, and pretty fun to see one that's going maybe a little bit more different to a few of the others out there. In any case, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to the Tyrannid army list down in the comments below. What have you been running since the data slate? And feel free to let me know any other insights or corrections as to how these were run. Obviously they're not my list, so I only have so much understanding of them. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.